The child's laughter echoed across the dusty ranch like a promise he never thought he'd hear again. For 3 months, little Sarah had called him Daddy, with the innocent certainty that only orphaned hearts possess. Now, standing before her mother's weathered door in the fading desert light, he understood the cruel mathematics of love. Sometimes claiming what feels rightfully yours means breaking the very thing that made you whole. His calloused hand trembled against the wooden frame as her voice drifted from inside, the same voice that had whispered his name in passion years ago, before promises turned to dust and he became just another ghost riding the endless horizon. Subscribe to discover if some wounds can only heal through surrender. The morning Sarah first reached for his hand, Marcus felt something inside his chest crack open like drought-hardened earth receiving rain. She couldn't have been more than 6, all wild curls and sun-freckled cheeks, standing beside the overturned stagecoach where her grandmother lay still beneath a bloodied shawl. The other passengers had scattered like tumbleweeds, but this little one just stood there, her enormous brown eyes fixed on him with a trust that made his throat close. When she slipped her tiny fingers into his weathered palm and whispered, "Are you my daddy now?" The question hit him harder than any bullet ever had. He'd been drifting for 7 years, carrying nothing but regret and a faded photograph, but in that moment, everything shifted. The weeks that followed blurred together like heat mirages on the desert floor. Sarah chattered constantly as they rode toward the nearest settlement, her small body pressed against his back, her arms wrapped around his waist with the fierce grip of someone who had learned too young that people disappear. She told him about her grandmother's stories, about the mother she barely remembered, about dreams where angels had golden hair like his. Marcus found himself slowing their pace, taking longer routes, stopping to pick wildflowers that she'd weave into his horse's mane. For the first time since the war, he wasn't running from something, he was protecting it. When they finally reached Copper Creek, the townspeople eyed them with the suspicious curiosity reserved for strangers carrying secrets. Sarah clung to his leg as he inquired about lodging, her face buried in his dusty coat. The hotel keeper, a stern woman with steel-grey hair, looked from the child to Marcus and back again. "She yours?" she asked bluntly. Before Marcus could answer, Sarah lifted her head and declared with absolute certainty, "This is my daddy." The words sent a shock through him so profound he had to grip the counter to steady himself. The lie felt more true than any truth he'd ever known. They took a small room above the general store, and Marcus watched Sarah arrange her few possessions, a wooden doll, a faded ribbon, a pressed flower, with the careful precision of someone who had learned to make any space feel like home. She hummed while she worked, the same melody his own mother had sung to him decades ago. That night, as she curled against his side like a trusting kitten, her breathing deep and even, Marcus stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of responsibility settle over him like a warm blanket. He had never wanted anything as much as he wanted to be worthy of her faith in him. The days in Copper Creek took on a rhythm that felt dangerously close to happiness. Sarah would wake him with sticky kisses and demands for pancakes, then spend her mornings helping him with odd jobs around town, while chattering about everything and nothing. The other children gradually accepted her, drawn by her infectious laughter and the way she could turn any game into an adventure. Marcus found work at the livery stable, his hands remembering the comfort of honest labor, his ears tuned constantly to the sound of Sarah's voice drifting from the schoolyard. When she ran to him each evening, her face bright with the day's discoveries, he felt something he'd thought the war had killed forever: hope. But happiness, Marcus had learned, was as fragile as morning frost in the desert. It was Mrs. Henderson, the schoolteacher, who first mentioned the name that would shatter his carefully constructed peace. "Sarah's been asking about her mother again," she said one afternoon, her voice gentle but concerned. "She says her grandmother told her stories about a woman named Elena who lived in Silver Ridge. Perhaps it's time to help her find her family." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow, stealing his breath and sending his heart into a wild gallop. Elena, the woman who had loved him and left him, who had promised to wait and then vanished like smoke. The woman whose photograph he still carried, whose memory had driven him into 7 years of wandering. Sarah's mother. The photograph trembled in Marcus's hands as he held it up to the lamplight, comparing the faded image to Sarah's sleeping face. The resemblance was undeniable. The same delicate nose, the same stubborn chin, the same way of tilting her head when she was thinking. Elena's eyes stared back at him from the worn paper, full of the love and promises that had sustained him through the darkest days of the war. He remembered the weight of her body against his, the way she'd traced the scars on his chest with fingers that shook with tenderness, the morning she'd whispered that she would wait for him no matter how long the fighting lasted. He had believed her, with the desperate faith of a man who needed something pure to survive the horror. The journey to Silver Ridge stretched before them like a path to Judgment Day. Sarah sensed his tension, her usual chatter subdued as they rode through the endless expanse of sage and stone. She asked fewer questions, but her small hand found his more often, as if she could feel the storm gathering in his chest. When they stopped to water the horses at a creek, she looked up at him with those enormous eyes and asked, "Are you sad, Daddy?" The word still sent lightning through his veins, but now it carried the weight of deception. How could he explain that he might not be her father at all, but rather the man who had loved her mother and lost her to time and circumstance? Silver Ridge appeared on the horizon like a mirage of memory, its dusty streets and weathered buildings exactly as Marcus remembered them. 7 years had passed, but the town seemed frozen in amber, preserved in the same state of hopeful decay that had characterized it when he'd left for the war. Sarah pressed closer to him as they rode down Main Street, her eyes wide with curiosity and something that might have been recognition. "It feels familiar," she whispered, and Marcus's heart clenched with the possibility that she might remember this place, might remember the woman who had given her life here. The house stood at the end of Maple Street, its white paint peeling like old skin, its garden overgrown with wild roses that had forgotten their boundaries. Marcus recognized it immediately, the same porch where he and Eleanor had sat planning their future, the same window where she'd waved goodbye when he rode off to war. His hands shook as he helped Sarah down from the horse, her small body suddenly feeling impossibly precious and fragile. A woman emerged from the shadows of the porch, and Marcus's world tilted on its axis. Elena. Older now, her dark hair streaked with silver, her face marked by years of worry and loss, but unmistakably the woman who had owned his heart. She saw Sarah first, her hand flying to her throat as recognition dawned in her eyes. "Sarah," she whispered, the name falling from her lips like a prayer. Then her gaze lifted to Marcus, and he watched as shock, joy, and something that might have been fear warred across her features. "Marcus," she breathed, and the sound of his name in her voice transported him back 7 years to a time when the world had made sense and love had seemed possible. Sarah looked between them with the sharp intuition of childhood, her small hand tightening in his as she sensed the undercurrents of adult emotions swirling around her. The silence stretched between them, like a chasm filled with unspoken words and broken promises. Elena's eyes never left Sarah's face, drinking in every detail, as if trying to memorize her daughter after years of absence. Marcus felt the weight of explanation pressing down on him, the need to justify why he had this woman's child, why he had allowed Sarah to call him father, why he had come here at all. But before he could speak, Sarah stepped forward with the fearless curiosity that had first captured his heart. "Are you my mama?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Elena's composure cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks as she nodded, her arms opening in invitation. And Marcus watched, his heart breaking and healing simultaneously as the child who had saved his soul ran into the arms of the woman who had shattered it. "Sim, escrevo os capítulos 3-5. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street as Marcus stood outside the general store, watching Elena through the window. She moved with practiced efficiency, measuring flour and counting coins, but he could see the tremor in her hands, the way she glanced toward the door every few minutes. Little Sarah sat on a wooden crate nearby, humming softly while she braided wildflowers into a crown, oblivious to the storm brewing between the adults who claimed to love her. Marcus pushed through the door, the bell chiming his arrival like a funeral toll. Elena's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't turn around. "We're closed," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above Sarah's gentle humming. The child looked up, her face brightening with innocent joy. "Daddy, you came back!" She scrambled down from the crate, her small arms wrapping around his legs with the fierce devotion only children possess. The word "daddy" hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, and Marcus felt Elena's pain as if it were his own. He knelt down, gathering Sarah into his arms, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair while his eyes never left Elena's rigid form. "I promised I'd always come back, little one," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "A man's word is all he has in this world." Elena finally turned, her face a mask of controlled anguish. "Don't make promises you can't keep," she whispered, her dark eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Not to her. She's already lost too much." The accusation in her voice cut deeper than any blade, and Marcus felt the familiar weight of his failures settling on his shoulders, like dust from a long journey. "I kept my promise to you once," he said quietly, setting Sarah down, but keeping one protective hand on her shoulder. "I came back from the war just like I said I would, but you were already gone." The words tasted bitter in his mouth, carrying the weight of 5 years of searching, of wondering, of hoping against hope that somewhere in this vast wilderness she was waiting for him. Sarah looked between them with the intuitive wisdom of a child who had learned too early that adults carried secrets like stones in their pockets. "Mama, why are you crying?" she asked, reaching up to touch Elena's face with gentle fingers. "Did someone hurt you? Daddy won't let anyone hurt us anymore." The simple faith in her voice shattered something inside both adults, leaving them raw and exposed in the golden morning light. The afternoon heat shimmered off the desert floor as Elena led them to the small cemetery behind the whitewashed church. Her steps were measured, deliberate, like a woman walking to her own execution. Marcus followed, Sarah's small hand tucked securely in his, while the weight of unspoken confessions pressed down on them like the merciless sun. The wooden crosses stood like silent sentinels, marking the dreams that had died in this unforgiving land. Elena stopped before a simple grave marked only with a weathered stone. "This is where I buried him," she said, her voice hollow as an empty well. "Your son, Marcus, the child I carried while you were playing soldier in someone else's war." The words fell between them like hammer blows, each one driving deeper into the foundation of everything he thought he knew about his life. Marcus staggered backward, his face draining of color as the truth hit him with the force of a stampeding horse. "My son?" The words came out as a broken whisper, his knees threatening to buckle under the weight of this revelation. Sarah pressed closer to his side, sensing his distress with the uncanny perception children possess for adult pain. "He lived 3 days, Eleanor continued, her voice steady now, carved from stone and bitter experience. 3 days of fighting for every breath while I prayed to a God who seemed to have forgotten we existed. I named him Thomas after your father. I thought if you ever came back you'd want to know he had a strong name." Her composure cracked slightly, a single tear tracing a path down her dust-stained cheek. The desert wind picked up, stirring the dry grass around the grave like whispered prayers. Marcus knelt beside the small mound, his calloused hands trembling as they touched the sun-warmed earth. "Why didn't you wait?" he asked, his voice breaking like a boy's. "I would have come back sooner. I would have found a way." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were hollow comfort, promises made too late to matter. Sarah knelt beside him, her small hand covering his larger one. "Is this why you're sad, Daddy?" she asked, with the devastating honesty of innocence. Because someone you loved went to heaven? Eleanor watched this tender scene unfold, her heart breaking anew as she saw her daughter offering comfort to the man who had unknowingly shaped both their destinies through his absence. The saloon was nearly empty as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Marcus sat alone at a corner table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey his only companion, while the weight of the day's revelations pressed down on him like a physical burden. The amber liquid burned his throat, but it couldn't wash away the taste of regret that coated his mouth like desert dust. Elena appeared in the doorway like a vision from his past, her silhouette framed by the dying light. She moved through the empty room with the grace of a woman who had learned to carry her sorrows with dignity, her dark skirts whispering against the wooden floor. "Drowning your guilt won't bring him back," she said quietly, sliding into the chair across from him. "Trust me, I've tried." 5 years, Marcus said, his voice rough with whiskey and unshed tears. 5 years I've been searching for you, thinking you'd left because you didn't love me enough to wait. And all this time—" He couldn't finish the sentence, the words too heavy with pain to speak aloud. The silence stretched between them like a chasm carved by time and misunderstanding. Elena reached across the table, her fingers barely brushing his knuckles. "I left because I loved you too much to watch you choose duty over family again," she whispered. "When the baby died, I couldn't bear the thought of you coming home to another grave, another failure you'd blame yourself for. So I ran, and I kept running until I found this place." "And Sarah?" Marcus asked, his eyes searching her face for answers he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. "Where does she fit into this story of ours?" The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire, carrying the weight of possibilities that could reshape everything they thought they knew about love and loss. Elena's composure finally cracked completely, her shoulders shaking with the force of suppressed sobs. "She's not mine by blood," she confessed, the words torn from her throat like a prayer wrung from a dying woman. "I found her 3 years ago, abandoned by the side of the road, half dead from hunger and exposure. But when she looked at me with those eyes—" "Marcus, she has your eyes, and when she called me Mama for the first time, I knew God was giving me a second chance at the family I'd lost." The truth settled over them like dust after a storm, transforming everything they thought they understood about fate and redemption. 6 months later, the small church at the edge of town witnessed a ceremony that spoke more of healing than celebration. Elena stood in her mother's ivory dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, while Marcus waited at the altar in his only clean shirt, his hands steady for the first time in years. Little Sarah sat in the front pew, swinging her legs and clutching a bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked that morning, her eyes bright with the joy of a child who finally understood that families could be built from broken pieces. The preacher's words echoed through the wooden walls, but what mattered most were the silent promises exchanged between two souls who had learned that love wasn't about possession, but about choosing to stay when staying was hard. Elena's voice trembled as she spoke her vows, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that sometimes the very thing that breaks you can also be the thing that saves you. Marcus slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, and in that moment, the weight of his past finally lifted, replaced by the gentle burden of a future worth fighting for. As they walked down the aisle together, Sarah running ahead to throw her petals in wild abandon, the congregation saw not just a wedding, but a resurrection. The drifter had found his home, the widow had found her peace, and the little girl who had called a stranger Daddy had given them all the greatest gift of all, the courage to believe in second chances. Outside, the desert wind carried the sound of their laughter across the endless horizon, a testament to the truth that some families are not born, but forged in the fires of forgiveness and sealed with the promise of tomorrow.